Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the How to Pitch Thailand to Funders, hosted by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center. I would like to thank the original owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Ora Nation, for the past, present, and emerging emerging for taking care of the land in which the University of Sydney stands on. Today's presentations are made possible by the generous support of the School of Social and Political Science at the university, and of course, SEAC at the University of Sydney as well. I'm really excited today to bring to you 5 scholars from across the social science and across the world to tell us about how to be successful at getting funding for research relating to Thailand. This is the very first time we're doing any kind of workshop relating to getting funding, but I think it's at this critical moment in not just for scholars of Thailand, but all social science scholars to learn from each other about how we may best position ourselves, our research, and our future research collaboration to be able to take advantage of the number of fundings available for our work. So today's, we're going to have presenters, 6 different presenters, and we're going to be starting with the presenters based on their geographical location. So we're starting from the north of the globe all the way to the southern hemisphere. But let me introduce you first, the 5 speakers of today, their name and title, and then we'll immediately move on to the first presentation. So we have today Professor Tara Haberkorn, Professor of Southeast Asian Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's actually at the moment in Thailand. Then we have Professor Duncan McCargo, the Director of the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, who's going to be presenting on the UK and Europe. Then we have Professor Piya Pongsa Pitaksanti, who's a Professor of Sociology from Kyoto Sangyo University in Japan. And then we have Associate Professor Ganokwan Manorom, who is a Professor of Anthropology from Ubon Ratchathani University. And then we have Professor Philip Hirsch, who's a Professor of Human Geography from the University of Sydney, and he's going to be presenting his presentation on Australia, and he's currently in Thailand as well. So, and I will, at the end, provide a brief discussion about what it means for early career researchers looking to gain funding and what it feels like to have to be in this big sort of race for funding, what we can learn from lessons from more established scholars about how to be successful in securing research funding. So we'll start with you, Tara. Perspectives from the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aim. This is a great initiative. I will keep my comments brief because I suspect that there will be lots of interest in Q&A. So I want to make 3 points, and I should start off by saying, for people who aren't familiar with the work I do, I'm someone who's kind of between the humanities and social sciences, which is sometimes useful in terms of funding and is sometimes a challenge in terms of funding. In terms of the US is somewhat different certainly than Australia, where I was for 8 years, and I imagine is somewhat different from Europe and the UK and Canada as well, in that there is no general body in the US that's like the Australian Research Council or the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada, or I can't remember the name of the same entity in Europe, but there's not one big general body that everybody can apply for. So in the US, one has to be, in a sense, somewhat more enterprising depending on what field you're in. The three main bodies that people working across social sciences and humanities can apply for that are somewhat similar to those big funding agencies in other countries, but have a much narrower scope, are the National Science Foundation, if one's work fits into their boundaries, particularly political science, sociology, law sometimes, anthropology sometimes, the National Endowment for the Humanities, which actually a lot of the social sciences, you can also apply for National Endowment for the Humanities grants, and then the National Endowment for the Arts, which is definitely much more art focused, but funds literature, funds translation, and has generally not funded a lot about Southeast Asia. So it's a good place. It's a good place to start. That brings me to my second point, which is that one of the questions AIM asked us was, how does one pitch projects about Thailand? I think this is always the question. Thailand isn't China, Thailand isn't Russia. So it's not a country that is not automatically of interest to funders, because it's not automatically of interest to governments. My sense from having been in Australia is that in Australia, one can make the argument of Thailand's importance as a regional neighbor to Australia. This is not the case in the United States, where Thailand is very marginal for the government. So you have to use other strategies. What are some of the strategies that one can use? So first of all, you can think, sort of the way in which comparative politics scholars think about what are the aspects, for example, of the regime in Thailand that would be of interest to, say, everybody who's interested in rising authoritarianism in the world, or everybody who's interested in comparative studies of monarchies. Those are sort of often the rising authoritarianism in the world is a good way to do it. The way I usually frame the question is, rather than saying that Thailand is super unique, which I think is not true anyway, but is to say, why should people who aren't specifically interested in Thailand care about what I'm doing? And then that pushes you to think, okay, what would someone who's interested in electoral politics care about my study about Thailand? Or someone who's interested in political prisoners, why would they be concerned with what's going on in Thailand? So that's sort of what I would say about how to make Thailand appealing to funders. Sometimes I think in the US context, actually, the fact that Thailand isn't of interest means funders are interested, because they get so few Thailand projects that cross their desk that can be quite helpful. The next point I want to make is, and this is particularly for early career researchers, but for everybody, ask a lot of your colleagues, both those who are your sort of horizontal fellow early career researchers and your senior colleagues, for their advice and to read your proposals and for help. Also, think critically about the kind of response you get, in the sense that I sometimes think that early career researchers are urged to play it safe in terms of the topics they choose and how they frame their work. And I would say, embrace the wildest work you want to do. Not least because if you happen to get funded and you commit to writing the book or the series of articles, you have to actually do it. So make sure it's something you want to do. Also, I sometimes find when someone tells you that your idea is too out there or is too, is too hard, it might be. So think really hard about that comment, but also realize that it, for you, it might not be, and you should try to do that really tough project that other people think maybe you can't do. The final point that I want to make, again, something I think doesn't get said nearly often enough, is that the more you apply for grants and fellowships, the more you will get rejected from them. Keep applying. I think everybody, if you look at someone's bio, you see a list of everything they've applied for. I can tell you in my case, almost every grant that I've ultimately gotten, I was rejected for at least once. And there's many grants that I've never received that I've applied for more than once. This isn't a bad thing. If you get rejected the first time, don't take it personally. Look at your proposal and think, how could I write a better proposal? And then improve it and do it again. And if ultimately it doesn't get funded, again, if you always write proposals for work that you're interested in actually doing, the proposal will be of use for you. Use writing a proposal as a way to think about your work. But getting turned down once is not a reason to do anything other than revise and apply again, or apply to a different funding agency if you realize, oh wait, maybe I applied to the wrong place. So I will stop there and hand the screen back to colleagues.
Thank you, Taro. Next up, we have Duncan, who would provide perspectives from the UK and Europe. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think I might have drawn the short straw here because there's an awful lot of countries in Europe, and then the UK is a whole little world of its own. So I've got an immense amount to cover, and I'm just not going to be able to cover all of it. So let me not try to do that, but to focus in on a couple of things that might be particularly useful. And most of what Tyrrell just said also applies very strongly. I'm focusing in on a couple of programs, a couple of funders here where I know that the way they do the assessment is really about the quality, the academic quality of the applications, and they're not fixated on particular notions of what it is that you should be applying for. So I've had a couple of fellowships in the Leverhulme Trust in the UK. There are other funding agencies in the UK. I could talk about the ESRC, the British Academy, the AHRC, and those, anybody who's working in the UK will know about those, and they can Google them or find out about them. But let me tell you a little bit about Leverhulme and just a couple of the schemes that people might be less familiar with. I had 2 fellowships from Leverhulme, and so I'm a bit of a fan of theirs. And people tend to know about the regular research grants and about the major research fellowships and the research fellowships. Let me tell you about a couple of others, though. One of the fellowships that's particularly interesting that I did have a few years ago is the International Fellowship, which used to be called the Study Abroad Fellowship. That basically funds people, now this is assuming that you're starting in the UK, funds people to go and spend time abroad between 3 and 24 months. And I was able to go to Cambodia using this fellowship for a year at a point when I didn't have much knowledge or expertise about Cambodia. And I wrote a story about how I've been working on neighboring countries and I was interested in a series of interrelated issues. And I got an institute in Cambodia to sponsor me, and I went there for a year. That fellowship wasn't nearly as competitive as the regular ones where you get the research fellowship to be based at the institution in the UK. It's designed for people who already have an institutional base in the UK and want to go somewhere. And that really is an interesting one. Perhaps even more interesting is one I haven't applied for, and I'm not sure whether it was around in this form when I was in a position to do so. And that is because the names with Leverhulme are sometimes a bit confusing, the study abroad studentship. Okay, now you might think that anybody who's not currently a student couldn't get a study abroad studentship, and then you wouldn't even click on the link. And let me tell you, that's not exactly true. Okay, turns out that anybody who's been studying in the last 8 years is eligible to apply for a study abroad fellowship, and that a study abroad fellowship can be used for postdoctoral work. So if you are eligible, you're resident in the UK for 3 years at the time of application, so you don't have to be British. You've got an undergraduate degree and a degree of some sort from a UK institution, including a PhD. You could use that. You could go to Thailand as a postdoc fellow with your PhD and spend up to a couple of years there. Using that funding is 12 or 14 months, 12 or 24 months of funding. So that Leverhulme study abroad studentship, which sounds like if you finish your PhD already has nothing to do with you, is actually a very interesting possibility to look at. So I'm just flagging that one up. There's obviously a lot more that you can find. I recommend people look around on the websites of Leverhulme as well as British Academy, AHRC and ESRC. But I want to call people's attention to those because quite often what people want to do is go and spend some more time doing field work and getting to know places that they're studying. So that is a great one. And as I say, you don't have to be British and you don't have to have a position in the UK university to get that last one. Okay, then when it comes to European funding, there's an immense amount to discuss. There's all sorts of funding from European sources, and there's a bewildering range of different projects and headings on those EU websites, and you really need to establish contact with people who are familiar with this in an institution that you'd like to go to and talk to them and spend quite a lot of time online. But also it really helps if you know some people who understand it, because it's kind of a bewildering zone, the zone of European Union funding. There's an immense amount of money slushing around, but let me tell you about the one that I think is most likely to be most interesting to people on this call, which is Marie Curie. So there's this wonderful program called Marie Curie. It gives you usually a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship. There's a very nice salary. It's a kind of pegged to European Union notions of what people should be paid. So if you come to Copenhagen, you get paid very generously, although it is an incredibly expensive city to live in. So Marie Curie, basically you apply, the deadline this year is going to be the 14th of September. You come up with a proposal. We currently have someone at the University of Copenhagen who's working on Cambodian textiles. She just got this Marie Curie. So it doesn't have to be anything that's kind of very obviously related to the collective political interests of the European Union. It really is judged on academic merits. And the trick is to find the right institution, because part of the narrative has to be a narrative about how the institution that you're applying to would be the logical place for you to pursue this project. So here's the commercial break. And if anyone wants to come to Copenhagen to the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies to do something on Thailand, we can write a story about how that would make sense. You can easily imagine how that could be crafted, and we had some text ready to slot into your application. So look for a place that you'd like to go. The UK is teetering on the brink here because the government can't decide whether they still want to pay to be in the Horizon program. As of this moment, I believe you can still apply to the UK, but applications to the UK have fallen off quite a bit to Marie Curie. Basically the UK used to dominate the whole thing. Oxford and Cambridge were the two most popular destinations for Marie Curie, but number 3 is the University of Copenhagen, or it was last year. So look for the universities that have a strong track record and places where there's a natural fit with your project. A lot is about the academic quality of your project. As Tyrrell said, don't be afraid to do something bold. Though this is another thing with the ERC advanced grant that I applied for. It says you should come up with a high risk project where you're going to make some sweeping, wild, exciting statements. And then it turned out that mine was just too sweeping, wild, and exciting for the reviewers. So it's a tricky balance, but come up with something bold. And also the other thing I would say is your first paragraph has to hit people between the eyes, and don't tell anybody that you're thinking about this, that it seems this. Tell them that you are the person, that you have this incredibly important burning question, and that everybody reading the application should at this point just sit down and contemplate the incredible importance of your project. Don't hold back, because British people, people of Southeast Asian descent, sweeping cultural generalization, they often tend to play down their virtuousness. And in other countries, people are taught to sing their own praises. And yeah, we need to sing our own praises in these applications. Otherwise, we're going nowhere, because lots of other people won't hesitate. Okay, let me stop there. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Duncan. And one of the reasons we invite you also because, here you are, perfect fit. If anyone's interested in going to the University of Copenhagen, there's Duncan, who doesn't need to be convinced that Thailand is important. There you go. Next up, we have Ajahn Piya from Japan. Thank you, Ajahn Piya, for joining us today.
Let me share screen. Welcome to Japan. I'm Pia Pongsapisanti from Capital Sankyo University. Can you see my slide, right? Okay. I have to talk about myself. I've got Japanese government scholarship, and I'm studying master degree and PhD in Japan for 8 years, and then I'm working here in Japan around 12 years. So I have been in Japan for 20 years. So that's all. I got a lot of scholarship and grants in Japan. So that's why I think what I'm talking today that will be very useful to all of you today. Right. So first I would like to introduce you to, it's called MIX. I'm not sure they heard about this or not. It's called Minister of Education, Culture, Sport, Science, and Technology in Japan, and in Japanese called Manbuka Kakusho. Even myself, I'm have to apply for this application every year. It's very famous in Japan, and they provide a lot of grants for those who study, who work in Japan, or even who work who do some research in outside Japan too. This is very popular one, and they provide a lot of grants every year in this. And for funding agency, it's called Japan Society for the Promote of Science. It's called JSPS. It's very famous, and they support bilateral collaborations with Japan, with partner countries. They provide two main tasks. The first one is called it is joint research projects and seminars. If you, I think it's better for you to have some connection, or you have some co-researcher in Japan. That will be easier for you to conduct and apply the research. And the second one is just like Professor Duncan talked about. This is about research exchange in Japan. For those who want to come to work, do some research in Japan, you can apply for these. But you have to have a horse in Japanese university, and even Japanese institute research too. This will be easier for you to apply for that. So I have to say that in Japan, connection or your co-researcher is important if you want to come to conduct some research in Japan, or even you get some research grant in Japan too. So this is the first one about a mix. It is the biggest one, and I think it is really important research grant. And also, as I told you that the connection or relation in Japan is very important. So for those who want to find some those who work in the same field with you, it's called Program for Constructing Data Infrastructure for the Humanities and Social Science in Japan. So if you want to find someone that work in your field, you can go to this link and find someone in Japan that work in the field that related to your research field. I will attach this link to chat later, so you can go to search your co-researcher from in Japan in this link too. Right. And the next one is it's not grant, but it is for those who want to come to work in Japan, even for lecturer in Japan, or even work as a researcher in Japan. It's called JREC-IN. It's short for Japan Research Career Information Network. It is provide most work and opportunity for all of you to come to work in Japan. So mostly I have to say that mostly is in Japanese, but if they want to find someone who can speak in English or even in Thai language, they will provide information in this link. So you can search for this link if you want to come to work as a lecturer or even a researcher in Japan. I will attach this link later on the chat too. Right, except for mixed grant, there's a lot of foundations in Japan too. I think you know about that. The first is about Japan Foundation. It is very famous in Japan and in all over the world too. So they provide three major field in grant too, as it's written here. It is arts and culture exchange, Japanese language education overseas, and Japanese studies and intellectual exchange too. Is this not just focused on research grant, but also cultural activity that provide Japanese culture in the world, in overseas too. They provide not just only on-site event, but also online event too in this year, as I know. So you can go look at Japan Foundation. You want to search for more research in Japan, and except for governmental organization, as I told you, there's a lot of company in Japan that provide grants. For example, as you know, Toyota Foundation, Nippon Foundation. Nippon Foundation is different from Japan Foundation, and Mitsubishi Foundation. Even myself, I got some grant when I was a graduate student from Mitsubishi Foundation too, and also the Suntory Foundation, Inamori Foundation, and so there's a lot of private foundation in Japan that provide grant for you to come to conduct research in Japan. So you can look at that and apply for that too. As I told you, even myself when I was a graduate student, apply a lot of grants, and every year I got some grant from. It might be not that much money, but this is a lot. This is very good record for you if you want to apply for a research career in the future, right? And yeah, this is some strategic advice for me for if you want to apply for grant in Japan. First, as I told you that more application and report in Japan. In Japan, I mean for Japanese grant, grant in Japan is Japanese language. So I think it will be better if you find some co-research in Japan and conduct some research application, research implementation, and research report in Japan. This will be easier for you to apply and get a grant. And for theme in social science, and it's quickly, I think aging society is very important change in Japan, and I think all over the world in Asian country too, even in Thailand too. I think aging society, population, migration, culture, global culture, history, politics, economics, marketing, social media is some how can I say, the trend of a theme in Japan. So this kind of theme might be useful for all of you to guide you to apply for grant in Japan. Yeah, I have some more slide, but I If it's better to discuss this in discussion or not, you want me to give some more information here?
Sure. It's the last slide anyway, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I have some requirement to ask about large group or individual group. So I think both is fine. For individual funding, they provide some research for young researcher. I think in Japan, the definition of young researcher is might be around here under 30 or 40 years, something like that, or those who receive PhD within 5 or 10 years, something like that. And they have some program that provide research grant for female researcher support too. And as I recommend, I think large group funding will be easier for you to get. But as I told you that you should have a co-researcher in Japan. And for the theme, as I told you, comparative research, it should be easier to get grant in Japan. For example, comparison between Japan and Thailand or something like that, it would be easier. But if you have a specialty in that field, Thailand only grant, it should be okay too. Yeah. But I think that theme should be useful for Japanese part too. It will be easier for you to get a grant because the committee to judge your application, mostly they are Japanese. And the last one is about solo researcher or a group research. I think solo research should be okay, but you should have record and publication and specialty in that field. So as my experience, I recommend you to have a co-researcher in Japan to find co-researcher who works in for Japanese university or research institute. It will be easier for you to conduct application and get some grant in Japan. Okay, that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn Priya, for your comprehensive overview of Japanese funding landscape. I think given the recent conference on Thai studies held in Japan, Japan actually has extensive network of scholars who are Japanese who work on Thailand specifically. It shouldn't be hard to just get started by looking at names of scholars who were actually at, or were part of the Thai studies conference. So I think we're in good hands here, but it was an excellent advice to ensure that you have a Japanese partner when applying for a grant. Okay, next up, nowhere else to go but Thailand. We have Ajahn Kanokwan here from Ubon Ratchathani University.
Thank you very much. Can anyone see my slides? So my slide is appearing, right?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. Now I would like to talk about how to pitch Thailand to funder. And let me see. Okay, so I would like to overview the funding landscape and the culture of Thai research system. So right now, under the military government, the so-called, it's the research in Thailand really centralized by the National Higher Education Science Research Innovation Policy Council, we call NXPO. And ideally, the NXPO try to restructure all the public agencies for having the knowledge in order to support the government's policy on development and poverty eradication, and to enhance the economies of Thailand, strengthen the competitive advantage, and to improve the workforce in Thailand as well. And also, given this context, the Thai government required the seamless incorporations of higher education, science, research, innovation tasks together under one unit. And the NXPO has launched the 7 years the 7-year research policy strategy starting 2020-2027. So they got like 4 strategic platforms. The first one they call manpower and knowledge development. So they're focusing on national brain power ecosystem, and to support the EEC, for example, Eastern Economic Corridor and other new growth engines, so lifelong learning, blah blah. And also they have like research development and innovation for grand challenges. For example, they set the grand challenges, including resource, environment, and agriculture, aging society, quality of life, and security. And the third one on research development and for competitiveness. Of course, Thailand would like to be in line with international communities. For example, they try to focus on bio-circular green economy, the startup, the EEC, the food innopolis, and innovation. And the last platform called research development and inclusive, they focus on local economy, poverty eradications, and smart livable city. And within this platform, they set up 7 PMU program management units. So they have 7 PMU. The first one, National Research Councils of Thailand, this is very conventional. And the second one, they just established the National Innovation Agency. The third one we call the Agricultural Research Development Agency is a public organization. And the Health System Research Institute, of course, is quite conventional. And the fifth one, unit on area-based development, is quite new. And the brain power, manpower also new, and competitiveness also new over the past like few years. The focus of the research in Thailand, the granting agency in Thailand from 7 PMU, they focus on large-scale development projects, more than 100 million Thai baht, and more than 3 years project, and they evaluate through the objects and what you call the objects, KOR. Yeah. Next. And however, I did the research with Chulalongkorn universities like last year in order to where the social science stands within this overall national research agenda. We found out something very interesting. The challenges we have found that where the social science fit within this kind of mainstream research agenda in Thailand, we found that a lot of young and mid-career social scientists in Thailand, anthropologists, political science, and sociologists, and related other fields, they're very active. But since the national research agendas focus more on technology, innovations, and use this to support the government policy, making these young mid-career social scientists in Thailand couldn't be able to get grants by the government. And the government less encourage any basic research for new knowledge in social science. They support, but the grant to support is quite small compared to the money that they would like to spend on technology and innovation. And most likely we found that they ignore multidisciplinary research and frontier research. And the last one on cross-country research, because they try to focus more on Thailand, and the transboundary issues, it's not very focused, it's not very prioritizing. And so, and when we did the research, we also found that most of the staff of the PMUs, they do not understand what does it mean by social science research, because the government, they try to have large space on technology, agriculture, innovation, but they don't understand what does it mean by social science. It's so abstract. How you translate the abstract knowledge into tangible result in order to support the government policy, that's a big question. And the context specifics was not a focus as well, and short time frame for doing the research. For example, if they give the social science people to do the research, they would give them only 1 year, not 3 or 4 years. And the process of helping to develop from concept note to the full research proposal is not very effective, rather than ranking, and they don't have any powerful panel in order to shape or reshape the concept note in order to make the concept a better full research proposal. And they pay less attention on social science knowledge communication. And when talking about the staff who trying to do the research, particularly the young mid-career professional who just graduated from overseas, they got a lot of teaching loads. So this block or obstruct the capacity of the young researcher in Thailand. And what I'm going to offer, if granting agencies overseas would like to work with the Thai scholars in Thailand, I think the focus would be multidisciplinary research, and social science is part of that. And also making the social science in Thailand and also in the Mekong region more public issue or critical public issue, because I think a lot of problems coming up in Thailand in terms of politics, in terms of economy, local economy, a lot of gap between the rich and the poor, a lot of inequality in Thailand. They are relating development, human being, culture, and ecology. So everything's related. So we need to have more, bring social science as a public issues more and more, and try to address complex problems of the society. And we need to address complex problems of the Thai society. We need gather and activate the range of different types of knowledge, focusing on maybe gender, vulnerability, and on age groups, and also from different perspectives. And we need to get science policy forum on important social science issues. For example, like we need space for social science research to be presented, disseminated, and discussed more and more, not just within the very acquainted peoples or the people who say the same language. And also we need science communication in order to maximize the public outreach and disseminations of the knowledge that we are producing. And so far, key international research granting agencies who been playing a good roles in Thailand, from my perspective, not others, from my perspective, because Summanet, Sustainable Mekong Research Network, are granted by SIDA, and also Department of Foreign Affairs, DFAT, OSAID, and Japan Foundation, as Dr. Pia said, Todeta Foundation and others, and USAID and Asia Foundation. So this is from me. Thank you very much. I hope I wouldn't take a lot of time.
ขอบคุณค่ะอาจารย์กนกวรรณ and for reminding us all the political climate in Thailand, and have that in the back of our mind when we apply for funding. So the last country is Australia. So we have Ajahn Phil here to discuss Australia with us. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, thank you, Aim. I'll discuss Australia and a little bit about Thailand, just building on what Ajahn Kanokwan said, since that's where I'm based at the moment as well. In fact, I must confess, I've never really thought about pitching a country, whether it be Thailand or any other country, to funders. I think more about pitching an idea and then explaining why Thailand is a relevant context in which to investigate that idea. So that's maybe something we can pick up. And of course, there's no magic formula. It's a bit hard to generalize, given that we come from different fields in the social sciences and humanities, and some with an overlap into the natural sciences. The research is more pure and applied, and some is more collaborative, some is more individual. So it's a bit difficult to generalize. So what I'd like to do is to mainly summarize from my own experience, drawing out from that, under three main headings. The first is looking at research funding schemes, as some of the others have done. The second is to look at Thailand in its regional context, which is something that Ajahn Kanokwan's already touched on. And the third is this question, which Ajahn Pia has also started to talk about, the question whether it's better to think collaboratively or more as individuals. Especially for early career researchers, what's the best way to go? So if we look at research funding schemes in Australia, the first one that any academic thinks about is ARC, the Australian Research Council, which Tiroli have already briefly mentioned in comparison with the North American schemes. And this is, of course, a program which funds both pure and more applied research. It's an extremely competitive one. It's, as Tiroli said, it's sometimes quite discouraging that you have to apply for the same project 2 or 3 times. And likewise, I've got some first time round, I've got some third time round, and it's been mixed. But one of the things that ARC does allow, or at least it used to last time I was applying, was to explain what the project means in terms of Australia's national interest. That's a required category. And I always found this a little bit contrived, but at the same time, because Thailand is, if you like, within Australia's region, as it's seen at the Commonwealth level, it is, Thailand perhaps figures a bit higher in the scheme of things than it would do in Europe or North America. I'm not sure about Japan. And in fact, some research centers, including SEAC, I believe, have a kind of standard blurb which you can draw on or adapt to explain why it's so important for Australia's national interest. And you get a certain number of brownie points by doing so. One of the difficulties with ARC, for me anyway, is in making it work in collaborative research, because partly the time frame is so long, it's such a hit and miss about getting it. It's quite difficult to sort of enroll collaborators in Thailand on board within the application process. But that said, and I'll talk about this in a moment a bit more, it is a good springboard, I think, for establishing collaborative research frameworks. So I'd suggest that if you are thinking about ARC, think of it more as something self-contained, which has a potential to develop collaborative approaches. The ARSC's main program, I think relevant to those here today, is this discovery project. But they also have other schemes, including some early career researcher options, which pay salary as well as the research expenses. And then also there's something called the linkage scheme, which is more geared in terms of what ARC describes as industry, but in fact, it's not just a commercial, it's also government or non-governmental organizations. It's basically collaborative research serving the needs of agencies beyond academia. I've never been tempted to go far with that, because it's an even longer and more involved project which requires a commitment of funds from outside, but it may be relevant to some, and certainly it's open to those who are interested in working in Thailand. I won't actually say anything more about the schemes within Thailand, because Duncan has already referred to them, except just to emphasize the fact that there has been a bit of a kind of restructuring from the old SOCOR, the Thailand Research Fund, towards this SOCOR, the Science Research and Innovation structure, and also the fact that it's become, as I said, very kind of applied to Thailand's sort of commercial development and so on, which makes it quite difficult for some more critical social science to get into. I think it's important for Australian researchers to remember that there are other schemes than ARC. There's, for example, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which is not just for agricultural scientists. There's social science within that as well, or the National Humanities and Medical Research Council for those in the medical sciences. Again, there's potential for social scientists, but it really depends on which field you're coming from. And then there's, of course, the whole sort of almost boundless potential source of support from various international development agencies. But here certainly over my career from the late 1980s, starting at Sydney to now, there's been a big set of changes where international development agencies are really only interested in Thailand within its regional context. So that's the second main topic I'd like to talk about. And I'll do that by just reflecting on, I guess, some of the funding I've had over the years and how these projects have secured funding based on Thailand in this regional context. My, if you like, regional context is Mekong, mainland Southeast Asia, rather than ASEAN more generally, but some others may think in terms of ASEAN. And what I've listed here is out of I think 32 projects that I had funded over a similar number of years. I've just taken those out which had some component on Thailand. You'll see that almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them were looking at Thailand within its wider region. And I must say that this, at least initially and beyond, this wasn't really so much a kind of strategic push in terms of trying to get funding. It just happened to be where my interests went. But in reflecting, it certainly, many of these projects would not have happened if they were just on Thailand. They happened because it had to do with Thailand's relationships with its neighbors, role in neighboring countries, and so on. Something I'd like to emphasize maybe for early career researchers, I'm sure things have changed a lot since the late 80s, early 90s, but nevertheless, at some points that may be relevant, is that these first two, this asterisk, a few of these first two that have asterisk, they look like they're quite different in topic area, but in fact, there was a direct kind of sequence between them. And those first 2 years of funding I got from a very non-prestigious source of funding, i.e. the small research grant from within my own university, which, you know, is very small in terms of dollars. It was sort of fundamental in terms of providing a springboard for what came next, both in terms of topics, in terms of sort of ideas I wanted to expand on in looking not just in comparison, but also in the sort of more relational way with research in neighboring countries. So it didn't seem that consequential at the time, that grant, but it was really a fundamental catalyst. And so I would encourage people to think not necessarily in terms of big dollars, and not be discouraged if you achieve more success with the sort of more sort of close to home catalytic type grants, but at the same time, do think of them strategically and how they may move on. And I'll come back to this point when I in my final slide, when I talk about the question of individual versus sort of larger collaborative research projects. Other projects, I mean, you'll see that many of these projects actually came from various agencies that work in the field of international development, OSAID, Danida, and so on. So, for example, this one from Danida and on national interest in transboundary water governance in the Mekong Basin was a collaboration between Danida and the center that I ran at the time, the Mekong Resource Center, and that was actually proposed by them rather than us. And the interesting thing is that this is an agency which is not primarily a research agency, but you will find, I think, that a lot of international development agencies now do give more importance than they have done previously in certain kinds of research, for example, political economy studies and so on. But this is something which comes out of sort of established relationships rather than necessarily through a standard competitive research funding avenue. So there are different sort of avenues to securing research funding. Another one which is probably worth mentioning, that where there was a heavy Thailand component, but in the wider context of Southeast Asia, was a large SHIRC grant. So SHIRC is like the Canadian equivalent of the Australian Research Council, but just for the social sciences and humanities. And this involved, I think, 16 universities, and it was a very productive grant in terms of its outputs, but also wonderful for collaboration with a lot of Thai collaborators as well. And the development of this was a combination of sort of being invited in, but then having to put forward a competitive grant. And then there are the green ones are the ARC grants that I received, and the yellow ones are from others. So I'd emphasize, if your field allows it, to think whether your idea is one that is necessarily limited to Thailand, or whether it can be seen in its regional context, whether it be Mekong or ASEAN, or perhaps in a wider comparative context. For example, I think one of the questions in the chat box is a question of whether there's scope for collaborative research, or rather comparative research, between Thailand and Japan. And then the final point, I'd just like to sort of share some thoughts on experience in terms of individual or collaborative grants. I think in Australia, there's a sort of sense pervade, I may be mistaken, but it's a sort of sense pervade that young researchers need to kind of ride the coattails of established researchers, because the ARC gives, again, brownie points for established reputation of those applying, and therefore for less known, less well-published researchers, they need to have a kind of senior mentor or colleague to have a chance of getting in. Well, I mean, my experience is different, but I think it's better, certainly from my point of view, I'm very glad I started small and then sort of worked larger. It raises a question about whether, you know, reputation generates funding, or whether it's the other way around. But in the best of worlds, I think it does come this way. In other words, you don't apply for funding just for funding's sake. Funding is not really in between your sort of PhD and a sort of full teaching career through the postdoc, I don't think sort of funding is necessarily what builds your reputation. It's certainly you need some resources to do things, but there's then finally the question of what happens when you get into a big collaborative project. And again, from my experience, the bigger the project, and I guess the more central your role is in managing it, the less time you have to do the real research. And so I'd caution against the sort of temptation to get into a big collaborative project for the sake of it, because it can distance you, particularly for those who are interested in working in the field, working on the ground. There's enormous benefits and satisfaction in doing work collaboratively, but perhaps that's something that needs to be developed over a career rather than sort of jumped into first off as a sort of knee-jerk response to this concern that you need a senior colleague to help you get your first research grant. And at that, I'll hand back to Im for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajahn Phil. I'll just quickly have a brief discussion myself. For those of you who have joined in today, who may be an early career researcher like me, and may feel very intimidated and overwhelmed by this whole situation, and share a little bit about what it feels like for me as well. So let me see if I can share my screen. So I also feel quite intimidated by this whole thing. And felt like, my first thing was, who am I to be asking for funding? Nobody knows me. And I think this was how I felt. I still feel like that, to be honest. It's 5 years out of my PhD. I just feel like putting myself out there every time. I just feel this sense of imposter, and why would anyone give me money for doing something about Thailand, which is I still feel like I have to constantly justify it. Also, the struggle between of opportunity costs, time to write grant applications versus publication. When you're just starting out, writing a grant application is very time consuming. In fact, the Australian ones are the worst. They just take so long. It takes like 8 months to write or something like that. I think it's just, what's the right balance? And something that Ajahn Phil just mentioned is, how to build a network with already established scholars. How do they make them notice you and that, invite you to be part of their project, or do you want to? And unfortunately, I think a number of funding culture and landscape is changing, and that there's been more emphasis on giving more money to fewer projects in some fields, which means that projects led by already established scholars who have a track record of not just getting grants, but being able to deliver on those grants are becoming important, making it likely that some of the scholars starting out feel that they need to somehow coattail these established scholars. Sometimes the funding structure force these scholars to actually have to take on early career researchers. It's stipulated in the criteria for selection, and that can be for an advantage for a young scholar, where they basically said, you need to have an early career researcher in your team. And sometimes I would get approached by scholars just because they need to have an ECR, where I don't know how I'm benefiting the team. And that's something that Ajahn Phil mentions, that, don't say yes to everything just because somebody asked you. It could just be, you could just end up doing all the admin work that's relating to running a project. So I thought, about opportunities that are presented to ECR researchers. I think the very first one, and I think this is something that has only happened in the past few years, is that I think increasingly our success is going to be judged by our grant track record as much as our publication track record. And I think that we have to accept this reality in some extent. I'm not saying, this is I'm part of an ECR networking group in my universities, and we have, satellite groups around the country in Australia, and just talking to friends and colleagues in Singapore and America, it's just this sense that it is not expected that you have a track record on grants. And it's just to demonstrate that you're a good scholar is no longer enough that you publish good work, and that you need to show that you can bring in money as well, unfortunately. And I think that accepting that is the first step to just looking at our career in a different dimension. Secondly, something that Tara also said, apply often, no matter how small. I was applying to everything since I was in a PhD student, like $500, a round trip ticket somewhere to a conference. All of those are skills that you acquire over time, is just practice. Looking at different types of funding, different requirements, applying the funding from different sources give you a breadth and some depth of how to apply for grants to different funders. Look widely at unconventional sources of support. So I was able to get quite a number of corporate funding for work on Thailand. And I just think it's like, I think what's something Tara said, like they don't see Thailand come across their desk often, but also it's just kind of off the beaten path. Like I would get money from Symantec, which is a software company that does antivirus, to look at the issue of disinformation in Thailand. This is quite kind of, I think if you're going to accept money from corporations, you need to have a separate conversation with yourself as well about, what line do you draw. I've also gotten money from different defense agency, and I know some of the participants today have as well. So there's that philosophical questions you ask yourself as to, who you are willing to take money from and to what end, and what does it mean to your research career. But I think you're looking widely, looking at unconventional sources of support is, it's maybe one way of breaking into this whole applying for grants thing. There are definitely opportunities that are focused on early career researchers only. I think that helps in terms of reducing the degree of competitiveness as well. And lastly, be flexible. Sometimes I have had to apply into a bigger project that Thailand isn't the star of the project, but is part of a project. And I think, you think about, am I willing to do that? Is this the way I'm going to fund the research that I need done? But I think ultimately, I always find that when I sign up to something or go for grants that align with what I really want to do, then once you get the grant, then you really want to actually do it. Like what Tyro said, sometimes I've said yes to something just because it's a collaborative and I like to collaborate. But then when you start doing it and you just like hating every minute of it because you didn't know why you say yes in the first place. And then now you're doing a project with like 15 other countries, and it just, so I think all of that is experience over time. So I'm still learning, but I still think that early career researchers can do this. There are lots of opportunities now that are focused on ECR, and in particular also women ECRs in some cases. And just being on the lookout for these opportunities, practice, get rejected often. You learn a whole lot from it, just like publications. But ultimately, I think accepting the reality that we need to do this more, and we are being asked to do this more now as a measurement of our success, is something that I think is important. So I'll stop there. And I think we should now go into the discussion. We have, I have a few questions. I have a couple of questions for the speakers today. And then we can really open the floor up. So Phil and Ajahn Pia has has answered this in terms of individual versus being part of a team. So what about the others? Can you please give us some thoughts on that, please?
I can start. My sense of the US funding landscape is that almost all grant opportunities are quite individual. At least that has been my experience in what I've applied for, whether it's been funds for a year of research funding or a residential fellowship to spend a year writing. You know, I know that the National Science Foundation in particular there are lots of collaborative projects through them, but I think the vast majority in the US context is set up to fund an individual doing an individual project, again, with the exception of the NSF and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I like to join I like to join this discussions. I think in Thailand now, the Thai Government Research Council would like to normally focus on large projects, and they need to get people from different universities to work together on big project in order to see the huge impact. Because they thought about evaluation. So this is this amount of money investing on something, you need to evaluate based on like SRLOI, return investment. This is a term that used in Thailand government, Thailand Research Council, or any PMU programs management units. So you need to have tangible result in order to get to renew the project or to get more budget from the government. This is the thing. But for the individual project, it's getting less and less. That's why not so narrow room for the young or early career researchers. Early career researchers have to work mainly with the established scholars, as M said and Ajahn Phil said. So otherwise they couldn't be able to survive because they've been evaluated by university. You have to get published, you have to get this and this and that. So this is quite a challenging issue in Thailand. Yeah.
Duncan, did you want to say?
No, it's very much what's happening in Europe and the UK is as Ajahn one refers to in Thailand, this move towards a science model where you have senior researchers who are organizing teams of people. So I've just applied for an ERC advanced grant, which is the biggest grant that an individual, I guess, can get in the European system. So you have to ask for 2.5 million euros, and you have to basically then to recruit a team of 5 or 6 postdocs and PhD students to work under you, and it has to be all about you. It's not it's a collaboration, but I'm the only person who's really in the application. I just sketch out the profiles of all the people that I would like to hire into this project, and that's the way it works. And the UK has gone the same way. The ESRC, I mean, I had £46,000 which funded essentially all my work on the insurgency in the south, and funded a considerable number of tangible outputs. If someone would just give me £46,000 again, I'd be really happy. But nowadays I have to ask for 2.5 million euro because that's the way things are going. And it is, on one level, it's great because if I got the 2.5 million euro, it can help to support people's careers, and those 5 or 6 postdocs can then go on to do great things perhaps as a result. But to me, it would make far more sense to give those 5 or 6 people the £46,000, and then we could actually give not just 5 or 6 people £46,000, but about 40 people £46,000. To me, the economies of scale are rather odd, but this is because these people are thinking science mode. They're thinking about labs. They're thinking about these god professors supervising whole teams of people with loads of equipment and this sort of stuff, and they're transferring that model into a social science context. And it's actually in some ways unhelpful, but there are certain advantages that it could make career opportunities for people. But yeah, it's all then becomes incredibly complicated. And I just, on one hand, I really want to get the 2.5 million euros, and on the other hand, they always say there's only one thing worse than not getting the grant that you apply for, and that's getting it. If I actually get all this money, it's going to be a total nightmare on one level, and you'll never hear from me again in terms of any academic work, because I'll spend the rest of my time trying to manage this project.
Well, I do hope you get the 2.5 million euros though. That's an excellent point about the social science moving to the science model, but like, we don't work like that anyway. Okay, we have some really good questions in the Q&A. So let's start with the first one. Two have already been answered, so thank you so much. So Edwin asked, I got accepted for a PhD in SOAS in London on modern Japanese and Thai history, but need to secure funding on my own. I'm looking for funding possibilities on Thai Japanese history. Do you have any tips? Okay, maybe just briefly respond to this and then you can elaborate a bit more on your typing and answer. That's okay.
Okay. I'm right in the answer that first I think I recommend you to find the Japanese government scholarship. Yeah, it is the biggest one and provide a lot of fun and grant for you to study and to live in Japan. Well, so you don't have to work by yourself. So if you got Japanese government scholarship, and then you should find a host in Japan by searching from internet and from the link that I'm sent to you. So I think that will be good for you to get grant in Japan. I don't know your major, especially in which field, so you can search for your specific researcher or advisor in Japan, and then you can apply for course in Japan after you get a Japanese government scholarship. Right, that's all.
Great, thank you. Next question by Kun Pon is part comment, part question. So the comment part is that I'm concerned about the ways in which countries like Thailand are pitched to funders in northern Western regions. While in spirit, some multidisciplinary and multi-institutional grants are supposed to be egalitarian and horizontal, in managerial and organizational practice, there's room for asymmetry in the ways in which cross-country partnerships tend to be structured within proposals. I have in mind, for example, the former UK GCRF large grants, loose grants from the US, and some international development agencies. Would any speakers be able to talk about ways of pitching Thailand in a way that is actually inclusive, equal, and ensures research partners operate with equity regardless of where grants originate? That's an excellent comment. Thank you so much. Any takers? Phil.
I think it's an excellent, really important comment. And as you say, there are structural reasons why this happens, but there are sometimes sort of conscious or unconscious sort of attitudinal reasons why it happens as well. I mean, essentially, you're talking about the big question of decolonizing research done on countries like Thailand or in countries like Thailand by people like myself who come from somewhere else. And it's not one with a simple or straightforward answer. I suppose the most optimistic response would be to say, well, if you're going to have a big collaborative grant where the money is coming from Canada or Australia or Europe, better to have people like Duncan or myself waste our time doing all the kind of managerial stuff and let the researchers get on with it. But that kind of evades the more fundamental issues in the question, which is about how the research is framed and carried out. From my experience, the best project that I think I worked on, which didn't entirely sort of get around this issue, but nevertheless sort of worked, I think, to its limits in trying to do so, was this project I mentioned, this challenge of the agrarian transition in Southeast Asia, where in no small part, just because of the sort of caliber of the Thai social scientists involved, and Vietnamese and Filipino and so on, there was, when it came to the substance, the academic work, there was a much more sort of horizontal structure. When it came to the management, though, the finances and so on, all the headaches were done, were felt in Toronto. And so being based in Sydney, I was quite happy about that. And I think some of my Thai colleagues would have been as well. In Australia, the funding agency I've worked with that's sort of maybe come closest, but certainly hasn't sort of evaded sort of completely sort of solved the issue, is the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. And it's a condition of that project, first of all, that the research be collaborative rather than being sort of Australian scientists teaching local scientists how to do research. And for many projects, there needs to be a kind of counterweight bit of research done in Australia as well, so that the issue, the topic under research is not only looked at within Laos or Thailand or Vietnam or whatever. So I think it's a model to look at. But nevertheless, there are still many sort of structural issues associated with your concern, Fran. So thank you very much for the comment and question.
Great. Next, we have Ajahn Chavalin, who's based here in Sydney and Macquarie University. She asked about referees. That's a great question. So she finds that it's challenging to approach senior researchers who might not know her to ask them to write a reference for her research. How do you establish relationships with your prospective referees?
I can say something about that if you want. I mean, knowing people has now become a very interesting thing, hasn't it? Because we know all kinds of people who we're meeting in Zoom calls like this. So actually you can get to know people more easily. So I think don't hesitate to reach out, send your articles or links to your talks or things you've done for podcasts. I'm of course fixated with these days, other outlets. Send them to people, senior scholars in the field, connect with them, ask them if they say, I'm working on this proposal, could we have a chat about it? And then you could slip in the, would you be in a position to help me? I mean, I struggle sometimes when people who I have absolutely no idea about contact me out of the blue and ask me to write letters for them, because that's rather difficult. But if you can establish a track record where at least someone has participated in an online event hosted by NIAS or co-hosted by NIAS and the Centre at Sydney or some of our other collaborators, then that's already a basis for building some kind of relationship. But yeah, don't hesitate to use these technologies and also reach out and tell people about what you're doing and ask them for conversations. Ask people for virtual coffee and talk about what it is that you're interested in doing. I think that's the way to do it. And yeah, some people won't respond and they're too busy, and sometimes I'm guilty as charged, but if I possibly can, I try to engage with people who reach out to me about these kinds of things, because it's really interesting for me to know what's going on, and also it's kind of part of the work. Yeah.
I'd like to add to that, based on my experience. Someone known me because of the publication and also other stuff from the conference, as Professor Duncan said. But one person came to me, she wrote email to me. I never known her, I never met her. She said, I would like to interview you. It's a part of my PhD dissertation. That's how the establishment starts. So I like the idea, just they email me directly, introduce herself, and then tell me about what she's doing, and then we keep the relationship. It is one way of doing this. This just through the interview. Okay, yeah, that's the example. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Jump in.
Taro, yes, please.
I was just going to jump in. I also saw that Ajahn Chavalin also asked the question later of, are people annoyed when they get these requests? And I would say no, never annoyed. And the emails that I respond to the quickest are if someone asks me for a letter, assuming I'm actually I know enough about their work to be able to write a good letter for them, or if I get a request to review someone's promotion file. Those are the emails that I respond to almost as soon as I get them. And the reason is because when I think of everything that I've been able to do, it's because someone else responded quickly and wrote a letter for me. So I think it's part of the work that we have to do. So I would say don't ever feel die about asking someone to write you a letter. Anyone who's in a position to write you a letter has had hundreds of letters written for them. So they should say yes. And if they don't, that tells you everything you need to know.
Excellent. Yes, Duncan.
Could I just jump in and yes, agree with that and say, yeah, and I am director of an institute for my sins, and I get about 100 and something emails a day. So if I don't, I try to reply quickly, but don't hesitate to resend it a few days later, because stuff gets lost in inboxes when we're traveling and we're in various different modes of cyberspace. So just don't take a failure to respond actually as a personal insult, but just take it as a cue to send a reminder.
And the scholars I've invited here are very generous senior scholars, all of you. So, to hear directly from them that they're open to being contacted by all of you who are here today, and those of you who may be listening to on Facebook Live, I think it's really important, and that I think we should hold on to that very senior well-established, successful scholars can be generous and can be nice. And in fact, many are. All of the ones here today are, and they understand. And I think, you know, if they're offering the opportunity for you to be contacted, this is really excellent, and that's probably the best contribution you can make for Thailand studies is your time. So thank you for that. Next question, Meng Hu. It's a specific question about ARC, whether or not PhD students are allowed to apply. Phil, I know there's some, yeah, Phil, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I believe that you have to have an established position because ARC doesn't pay salary. There are the DECRAs for early career researchers, which in principle, I think are open to those who've recently completed their PhD, but increasingly I've observed that they tend to go to academics who are 1 or 2 years into an existing contract or longer term position. But if you're still doing your PhD, the normal ARC schemes are not open. They're for those who already have a salary at a university.
Okay, next question. Thanks, Phil. Petra here. Hi, Petra. So her question is, do you have any advice for ECRs who are short-term contracts? A lot of postdoc fellowships are restricted by post-PhD age, and you cannot reapply, at least in the UK. And for other ECR grants, you have to be on a longer-term contract or in the tenure track position to be eligible to apply. If any of you can think of, in the interest of time, if you could just type in the answer, or maybe we could, I can canvas the answers for you, Petra, and send it to you by email. If we can think of any specific ones on top of our head, any of you. I know the Australia ones are not, are restricted by post-PhD age. Do you mean like you have to be within 5 years of PhD? Is that what you mean, Petra? Okay, but in the Australian case, I know that they take the, what's the term again, Phil? Opportunity, like those interruptions, those disruptions, like having children and things, what do you call it? Relative to opportunity. Very seriously. So if you have any disruption in your careers, like having to take on jobs that are not economic related, that adds further into your eligibility. So some of the grants have those specific criteria to account for scholars who have career disruptions in a number of different forms. So I know that one of our recent early career researcher who's got an ARC grant finished her PhD over 10 years ago, and it's a combination of 2 children, non-academic jobs, and a whole bunch of things that then still make her eligible, even though you're supposed to be only out for 5. Okay, next question, Remy. Hi, thank you. My question is the following. Based on your experience, how important is fluency in a Thai language to get research grants outside Thailand? Oh, that's a really good question. Any thoughts on this?
I think it's difficult to generalize. It's probably less of an issue now than it would have been under old sort of area studies thinking. But it surely depends on the field. I guess you need to show that you're able to do the research that you're promising one way or another, and it depends on how language dependent the research is. But my observation is that compared to say 20, 30 years ago, there's perhaps in the humanities social sciences more researchers who don't have fluency than there would have been in certain fields. I'm not sure that's a good thing, but yeah, maybe others based on your own disciplines may have experience and ideas about
Yeah, we can obviously answer this question in different ways, but kind of betraying my own prejudices, there's an alarming lack of interest in people's level of language skills amongst a lot of reviewers who don't seem to be aware that actually in countries like Thailand, you can't properly do some of these projects without. So there's all this stuff about, well, I'll hire a translator. And we all know about hiring translators and what kind of quality of data that's going to elicit for us on sensitive and complicated projects. So actually the answer is maybe, I don't know what answer you want to hear, but if the answer is possibly, from my perspective, not enough emphasis is being put on language fluency. As somebody who's turned away all kinds of people who want to do PhDs with me, when as soon as I said, okay, explain your project to me in Thai, that was the end. I come back in 2 years when you can explain your project to me in Thai. None of them ever came back. Sorry, but that's just otherwise we can't have a serious conversation. So yeah, but not everybody thinks like me, for better or worse.
I think it's quite challenging. Even we in the Mekong regions, 2 days ago, a few days ago, I had a meeting on the projects granted by Summonet ACI, and we work with the Mekong people from Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and we use language, the same language, not Thai language, not Lao language. So we need skills. The third language skill, like commonly like English. So it's yeah, okay, it's quite challenging if only talking in Thai language. It's quite challenging and difficult. Yeah.
Great. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We still have about 5 minutes or so. Okay, well, I have a question. What do you think about getting feedback from reaching? Okay, I think my household is falling apart. What do you think about contacting scholars to get feedback on your application? I feel like, or maybe it's a broader question about institutional support for grant writing and research funding. I'm fortunate to be at a university that provides extensive support at all types of administrative support to help you write grants and research grants, but I am aware that this is not the case. So what has your experience been in getting some kind of institutional support from your own institution, or maybe having to reach out to other scholars to get some feedback on your proposal? Or if you've done it, if it's a good strategy?
I can jump in to start to say my experience, and it sounds like Sydney Uni is similar to ANU. I found this to be one of the most valuable parts of being at an Australian university. I learned so much from the research office at ANU. I mean, how to write a grant proposal, sort of, for starters. My experience in moving back to the US is that there's nothing comparable. You are really on your own. And so I'm really grateful for everything I learned at ANU. So I think grant proposals are like everything else one writes. Ask as many people for their advice as possible. When I was at ANU, there were senior colleagues who were known to be like the kind of people who would just tear your proposal to pieces in your best interest to help you write a better proposal. Listen around for who those people are, and then ask them to tear your own work to pieces. I mean, if they're doing it, to be helpful. In some ways, those are the best kinds of colleagues to have. And they don't have to be necessarily senior. Horizontally can work too, but you want people around you who are going to be super critical, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And maybe one thing you can do is we do this in our department. It works sometimes better than other times, but we have these pitching sessions. And now, of course, you can do this virtually. So you can get a group of people together rather than wait for them to submit their written comments, which in my case might take a while because there's sometimes a backlog of paperwork. But if you say, can you join this Zoom meeting at such and such time and talk about my proposal, then you can get quite a bit by way of off the cuff responses and remarks. And be sure to record it because you're going to forget half of what they say and you won't have time to write it all down. But I suggest trying to do some pitching sessions. If not, we used to look for this kind of stuff with people who are physically around us, and we've learned as a result of this dreadful pandemic that actually we can link people together in different places and do that. So think about whether you can find a couple of people who might be in different parts of the world who can have a quick session going at you, talk for 5 minutes about what your main idea is, and you send them a document which they won't really have read properly before the Zoom call, but they'll skim it as you're talking, and then they'll throw out all kinds of random things, some of which are useless and some of which are the key to improving your proposal. Yeah.
Great. I just realized that I forgot to ask one question from Putipong about funding landscape in New Zealand. I'm really glad you mentioned this because I was thinking of inviting someone from New Zealand to talk, but then I was told, or I told myself that having 7 speakers is too many. I would like to cover Sweden, and I mean, we might have another round of this with different countries. But I'm happy if you can email me. I'm happy to put you in touch with the speaker that I was planning to invite, Ajahn Jim Oki, basically. And then I didn't want to invite too many political scientists. We're supposed to be social science, and now half of us are already political scientists. But I had a talk with him before, and he said that there aren't many places in New Zealand to apply. So that really, there's only very few agencies that do give grants. And I do know of one in particular where early career researchers have been successful. Eli Elinov, who's also in New Zealand, who's an anthropologist and does urban studies. So he can also help, and I can put you in touch with them both. So I think we're gonna conclude this really informative workshop. I have put out earlier when we announced this workshop that we will have a session where people can pitch their ideas about their grant ideas to us. We have had some submissions. We have had some submission, but I would like to actually open it up again. If any of you are interested in just pitching your ideas, it doesn't have to be long. In fact, I only asked for 250 words of a proposal or potential proposal that you want to pitch for a grant or even a postdoc project. Send it to me, and I have a few willing senior scholars who have told me already that they'll be happy to have a look at a short pitch, because the pitch is usually the summary of what you're going to be proposing for the rest of the application anyway. And if you're able to convey clearly how great your idea is within that short pitch, I think that goes a long way in giving you the confidence to then fully develop a grant proposal. And I would join a long list of scholars here today to also offer my help if you just need another pair of eyes to have a look at your ideas, just to bounce ideas. I'm happy to also do that as well. And so thank you everybody for being here. I've learned a lot, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise, and importantly, your generosity and support to advance research in the social science on Thailand. So I think if any of the participants today have any follow-up questions and don't know how to get in touch with you, you can also email me, but you can also Google them and send them an email. All of you here have agreed to offer advice if contacted. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining, and thank you to the Sydney Southeast Asia Center for making this possible. Have a good evening and morning, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.